have you found potential partnerships staged against providing evidence that you can get non-dilutive funding? I think that's, I believe that's part of the idea here.
Well, I think the non-dilutive funding and the sort of return on investment issue all kind of revolves around how much thought you've put into the design of your program. So the way the original question here was framed is, you know, should you be worrying about reimbursement and, you know, who's going to pay for your vaccine if you develop it. And I think that question is the first thing you should ask yourself before you pick up a pipette, let alone a pencil to sign a deal. And that is, can you make the justification for the ultimate expenditure by the government to buy and purchase and implement whatever product you choose to use? And that entails an enormous set of operations that take place during the development of the product, obviously, in order to culminate in an ACIP recommendation and ultimately a decision to implement. So
the wording of the question here was a little ambiguous, and I think that maybe provides us an opportunity to explore here. You know, paying attention to funding, well, I think that's, you know, is there NIH funding, BARDA funding, NGO funding, things along that line? That's pretty unambiguous. The reimbursement, however, could be taken as either, you know, reimbursement through such sources. Certainly historically, one of my most recent experience, unpleasant though it ended up in biodefense, was $1 billion carrot, but you got to spend all the money yourself to get there, and we'll pay you back when you get to success. That's the other kind of reimbursement. Mm-hmm. It's not reimbursement of the healthcare provider, but reimbursement through deal structure. So maybe you could talk a little bit to both of those. Certainly, before you pick up the pipette, you have to have a solid basis for believing that the product would be used and paid for,
right, in
a commercial sense. But also maybe talk a little bit to reimbursement of other types.
So in terms of reimbursement of development costs,
right,
you know, that's a solution that has several different faces. Obviously, we're at Vaccinate in the fortunate position to recently have been awarded a almost $200 million contract for the development of our pandemic and seasonal flu vaccine. So that makes a huge difference in terms of the ability to execute on what you've already set out to do. I think in the United States, even in the current climate, we're probably better off than most in terms of a variety of funding sources, but it's not as easy as I think it used to be, given the current financial markets and
so you're drawing from a variety of sources that Doug Given showed in his slides.
Yeah, I think some of the more practical funding sources may be curtailed a good bit in the next couple of years, just given the atmosphere in Congress. I mean, NIH is getting a hit, CDC is getting hit, and these are sort of the two major drivers of the public health
right,
system that we're feeding here.
Good. Don, you want to tell us a little bit about your thoughts and
Sure.
your company?
Yeah, so Ligacite, just a quick overview, is a virus-like particle vaccine-focused company. We have a norovirus vaccine that we've been working on, and I think I mentioned that because it dovetails nicely into the comments, Alan, that you made initially. I think of three things as it relates to funding and reimbursement. First, and Alan, as a good commercial person, you would know I would say this, the first place we've all started is what's the opportunity for the product, and that reimbursement, funding, ACIP recommendation, as we all know, is the cornerstone of any successful vaccine. So all of us, having been in that area, know that assessing the market, looking at the behaviors that take place, talking about advocate development, all those fundamental steps that we would all take are critical to that outcome that provides the revenue opportunity for any of our vaccines. The two other areas I'd mentioned that I thought of as we address this area are both risk aversion, risk affinity, which has been discussed quite a bit today. And then the policy making area. And one area that I think is new in that particular regard is the Therapeutic Discovery Project Credit that was enacted by Congress in the Healthcare Reform Bill as an example of work to help bridge the gap in company funding. I think I would acknowledge, and I suspect we all would, that it was pretty minimal in its spirit, or in actuality, but in spirit, I think it creates an opportunity for additional resources to help compensate some of those downsides that exist in the NIH funding, CDC funding. And I think Bio particularly is doing an excellent job of advocating for those kinds of programs to continue. I think we may have a shot of that in Congress. But I think the risk aversion, risk affinity question is one that's obviously an important one, and we all feel the pinch of the risk being shifted to the small biotech more and more, and if reimbursement and funding criteria became an additional burden, I think that risk is just adding to the list of things that are problematic initially. So we're trying to knock down risk barriers, not add them, and I think having to focus on additional milestones related to ACIP recommendations or funding hurdles from other sources would be very difficult.
I think the ACIP recommendation type hurdle, that is inherent in the business. I mean,
Right.
You need to generate confidence, and certainly have the confidence yourself that if you make it, it will find use.
Right.
But we're now sort of concerned about additional types of hurdles. You know, do you first have to provide evidence to the corporate partner or the VC that you're going to get a BARDA grant, or that you're going to get, you know, some other form of reimbursement or funding? And those are the incremental hurdles that we don't need, obviously. But if I were in a VC, I might actually like to see those if I could get them.
You know, I just might add one other quick thing. Many of you know we're located in Bozeman, Montana. That gives us access to our congressional representatives to a great extent because we're a big fish in a small pond. We've gotten good support from NIH, from Department of Defense, and other areas looking at our norovirus vaccine. We've also gotten great support in having our congressional staff help us get access to appropriations or other kinds of grants and funding. To date, and I'll emphasize to date, our venture investors have not required us to include those. In fact, it's seen as an upside. So we've been successful in keeping that out of any kind of goal or objective or financing requirement.
Keep it as an upside, not as a prerequisite.
Exactly. I believe we'll be able to continue that because the risk in government funding, I think, is greater than the risk in venture capital funding.
Totally true. Naranjan?
I think I can agree more with many of the statements made. Just very briefly, Inovio is a clinical stage vaccine product development company. We've got 3 phase 2 programs ongoing, in cancer. We have an infectious diseases program, phase 1 programs in HIV and universal influenza. And then we have a preclinical pipeline in emerging infectious diseases and so malaria, chikungunya, dengue, HCV. So we sort of, look at funding, government funding, non-dilutive funding, contract funding as sort of to balance out our overall funding sources. The one sort of slightly different angle I would provide here is, we did talk about the value of debt. Several speakers talked about the value of debt. And, we see this, the contract funding or government funding as a means to bridge that value of debt, not just directly, but enabling you to deploy your own internal investor capital towards developing products, pushing those products to the value of debt, while you use the non-dilutive funding to develop your pipeline. So that's one area where we've sort of strategically leveraged additional sources of financing. But I've got to tell you that it does come at a price. So there is, there's 2 ways of making decisions on product development or seeking funding. The first is you decide what products you want to develop and then go out and seek funding. And that's sort of the traditional investor capital approach. And the second is you go find where the funding is and then tailor your company or tailor your product development programs to go tap into into that source of funding. And that's, you're seeing more and more of that with the biodefense, companies focusing on biodefense, bioterror, neglected diseases, BARDA and IAID type contracts. So as a company, it becomes a challenge. Do you stay on your chosen path of developing products that satisfy investor returns versus going after these, underserved markets, which presumably may or may not have a commercial market available simply because of the source of funding. And so I think the way we've been able to bridge that is to help, certainly if you have a contract, and we do have an HIV vaccine development contract, which we appreciate the NIAID for. That helps us develop a set of programs, helps us develop the pipeline, while we deploy our capital on our HPV programs, on our universal flu programs.
You're certainly getting into an area I hope this conversation would go. With new funding sources, with pressure on some of the more traditional funding sources, is it diverting your companies? And I think you've appropriately raised the issue that it may change what products you even go after.
Sure.
I wanted to broaden that a little bit. What price tag comes with those kind of fundings in terms of how do they influence the way you run the business? Do they second guess? Do you have sort of an overhead of entertaining inspectors and visitors and managers from the funding activities? In earlier years, I've had many times the experience of bringing in a scientist to work in my companies who had a grant and brought it with him, and generally you allow them to do that, but in almost every single case you end up closing that down after time because both the employee has more fun in the commercial objectives and the grant stuff is a diversion. But is it actually changing now? To what extent is there a risk of these new funding sources or the emphasis on non-dilutive funding?
Well, I can give you a story that covers the polar opposites here. So when Vaccinate first started, the first thing that we set out to do was to make a universal vaccine based on the M2 ion channel. And somebody from the Gates Foundation happened to be at a talk where we were presenting this idea. And in a very compact set of negotiations, they gave us $15 million to do this, just like that. This is the old Gates Foundation,
Good.
So things are not quite that simple these days. On the other hand, this BARDA contract that I just mentioned took 2 years of filing papers and revisions and discussions and long periods of silence and finally an award after almost 2 years of negotiation. And with that comes a substantial amount of reporting responsibility, a new accounting system, several extra employees just to feed the machinery. But on the other hand, it allows us to do the work that we set out to do 4 or 5 years ago in a relatively free manner. The guys at BARDA, so far in its early days, and we're just getting started on this, have a fair amount of development expertise. So they really do understand what we're trying to do.
They understand what you're dealing with.
Yeah, so they're actually fairly helpful so far. So we'll see how it goes. But those are the kind of two ends of the spectrum there.
I've heard similar things about early days. I think this is a topic that should probably be refreshed next year, the next vaccine Congress. Other thoughts on the topic?
Ligacite was funded early on by a lot of government grants, contracts, DoD support, so the infrastructure there grew mindful of the environment that you were describing, Alan. So there wasn't a big transition as that funding has continued to go in smaller chunks. All those infrastructure things were set up to monitor and measure and keep track and account for all the different aspects of those arrangements. To the focus question, I think it's a very, very difficult one to judge because it's so idiosyncratic. I think there's a premise, as you suggest, Lance, that you need to stay focused on your core technologies. I think our strategy has been to look for additional funding where there are things that we would otherwise do on our own that then could be funded in some other way and therefore keep the focus on the core program or the core activities.
So you create somewhat of a filter. If it's a funding opportunity that advances what you would be doing, you go after it.
Yes.
If it takes you out of your intended business area.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I would just add that, you know, by and large, we haven't felt that the funding agencies have been intrusive into the company business. You know, so in that sense, it's a little different from your traditional, say, VCs, you know, where they're in your business all the time, day in, day out. But I guess a couple examples I would give is that, you know, we got funded through a DTRA contract to develop our core EP technology. Mm-hmm. And our deliverable to them was to develop a smallpox vaccine candidate. So we did that, but that was a deliverable to them, but we were able to use the technology that was developed to develop other programs and use it in other vaccine candidates. So I think it's been a win-win from that standpoint. And so the way we've sought opportunities is to see if there is, go after targets that help the government or help the funding agency, be it Gates or be it the Malaria Vaccines Initiative, and there's something in it for the company as well.
Are there questions that the audience wants to raise at this point? I have one or two other small areas I'd like to explore a bit. In the losing track. I'm looking for questions from the audience here and forget what the next question I was going to ask for. Kind of completely lost it.
If I may, or go ahead.
Please, it'll recapture my thought.
So maybe it might be a little bit of a tangent, but the one thing, you know, the one other thing we heard at this conference is more and more big pharma is also looking at accessing government capital, and you know, that's very interesting because as a biotech company, you know, we do look at non-dilutive sources of funding, and because we are entrepreneurial, we are opportunistic, we have the ability to maybe shift directions, shift gears if need be, or have a broader justification towards seeking newer targets, seeking newer funding sources. I mean, if there's big pharma people around, I'd love to hear from them how you know, they can justify to their investors going after you know, capital and government capital and going after going into disease areas which may not have a big enough market to justify the investment and the inertia to get an organization moving in that direction. But it's an interesting time, maybe because the financial climates are tight as it is, that it's no longer a purview of small to mid-sized companies, but big pharma is entering it as well.
I think they are. So my mental block was because there was a topic I really did want to ask you about, and it was pushing everything else out. And that's what I used to call the theory or the process of hoop management. So I've started from scratch 2 companies and gone through the multiple rounds of private financing. And one of the consistent observations in my experience, and I know a lot of others, is when you're dealing with the professional venture capital community, you are dealing with a bunch of very smart people who will put an amount of time and attention into it that you don't get otherwise. And you certainly don't get it from the larger public sector investors who've got, you know, billions of dollars under management, and they've got $1 million or $2 million in you, and you get 5 minutes of their time over the course of the investment. So the venture process, the private process, really adds value to the companies because they force you to really clean up your act. You get essentially free consulting of some smart people really putting you through it and scrubbing everything through a fine comb. My question to you is, to the extent you've worked with BARDA or some of the other public funding entities, do you derive that same kind of benefit? Do you see that, you know, that attention to depth and continuity and the hoop management aspect of iterative rounds of financing? Do you see that when you're working through BARDA? Or?
I suspect we will. Just from the first month or so of dealing with BARDA, they are very detail-oriented. They fortunately hired a lot of people with industry experience. Actually, a lot of our colleagues from Merck now seem to work for BARDA, which is kind of an interesting situation. But obviously, these guys have development experience and know where the weak points are and the strong points are and what to look out for and so forth. And I think that expertise will get recycled back at us. Now, we're fortunate because we're populated by a lot of sort of old line pharmaceutical vaccine development guys like myself. And so we're ready to receive that sort of counsel. Some people may not be, though.
I'm hopeful that as the projects that they're working with you on or helping on, at least through funding, that their connections and familiarity with the industry might, and their ability to bring big pharma to the table in creative ways, may help ultimate commercialization and application of some of the products you're developing.
One of the things that I think that their BARDA is going to be good for us is bringing the FDA to the table. Because as a sister organization in the government, they both have a, how should I say this, a shared goal in getting what we're trying to do finished successfully.
So I'm sure, Alan, I know your level of experience in the field. I'm not sure of yours in detail, but FDA, historically has never gives you a guarantee or enters into an agreement with how they will weigh in on something until after all the data is in. In my experience in the biodefense, the contracting agencies, this smallpox program that I set up was through the CDC, and the anthrax through emergency preparedness. In neither case did the FDA, were they consulted or did they look at or were allowed to look at the project plans and requirements in advance, which made it more challenging in both cases, even though one succeeded to meet all expectations. Are you finding the FDA engaged early? Are you finding that FDA weighs in and you have some agreement with the path before you enter into a contract or a major funding program?
So I can maybe share with you our experience on our NIAID contracts. So it's for development of HIV vaccines. We've completed the preclinical stage. We're in discussions on the clinical program. Our program officers have been great by and large. So we've had weekly meetings. While we may not benefit directly from interactions with the FDA, because we're working through NIAID and they've run hundreds of clinical trials. They've got the internal regulatory affairs group. So we do benefit from the collective experience of the broader group that's available to us. And in terms of designing preclinical studies, in terms of putting the packages together, we have a lot of that expertise in-house, but it's nice to, they do provide us with that sort of guidance. We also run through scientific advisory boards dedicated for each program, which is again managed through the DAIDs. So there is a certain level of feedback, and then there's also maybe a sense of greater conservatism that creeps in when working on contracts, that you're doing everything, because everything has to be dotted and crossed. As an entrepreneurial company, you might be willing to push ahead.
Unless we're diverging a little bit from our intended topic, but I would encourage all of you who are working with them to try to engage the FDA as early and proactively as possible.
Yes. Yeah. In terms of the BARDA contract we have, it's a milestone element of the contract, is to have a product development plan that has been at least examined and scrutinized by the FDA. So it's an integral part of the system in our case.
Understood. It's still my recommendation. That's a system where, yes, you get a contract, you have requirements, and one of the milestones somewhere along performance is to get FDA to agree to it. I think it would probably be more constructive if we could evolve to a situation where FDA is engaged in the discussion, even in some kind of a limited basis, so that before you get a contract with delivery requirements, at least there's a conceptual agreement by FDA on the path you're taking.
And in fact, that's what's happened.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's great. Any last questions before we break for afternoon tea? I think it's probably time then. I want to thank you all.
Thank you.
Excellent discussion.